Welcome, everyone. My name is Danielle Miracle. I'm the curator of visual materials at the University of Oregon Special Collections and University Archives. I am so thrilled to introduce this amazing panel of writers and scholars who will be discussing the significance of race and identity in children's literature. This event is hosted by the UO Libraries and the Eugene Public Library and is sponsored by the Oregon Humanities Center at UO and the National Historical Publications and Records Commission. Before I introduce our speakers, however, I do want to acknowledge the University of Oregon is located on the Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions in their communities at UO and across the land we now refer to as Oregon. The UO Libraries has operations and repositories at various locations in Oregon and wishes to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya peoples of the Willamette Valley of Eugene, Chinook, Clackamas, Kalapuya, Cathlamet, Molalla, Multnomah, Tualatin, and other tribes and bands in the Portland area, and the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians in the Charleston area. We express our respect for all federally recognized tribal nations of Oregon. This includes the Burns Paiute Tribe, the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, the Coquille Indian Tribe, the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians, and the Klamath Tribes. We also express our respect for all other displaced Indigenous people who call Oregon home. Also, before we begin, I just wanted to let you know that there will be time for your questions following the panel discussion. You may type them into the chat at any point during the conversation. There will also be closed captioning, which you can activate if you push the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Now, it is my great honor to introduce today's speakers. Keith and Shinoa Igawa are siblings who co-wrote and illustrated The Whale Child and Tanny's Search for the Heart. They are both enrolled members of the Lummi Indian Nation and are of Lummi and Sakalam heritage. Shinoa Igawa is a ceremonial leader, singer, speaker, environmental activist, and artist dedicated to bringing healing to our Mother Earth and to people of all cultures, backgrounds, and origins through recognition of our shared experiences as human beings. Shinoa has long been active in local and international work for Indigenous peoples, children, and the environment. For over 20 years, she has worked in Washington state schools, creating programs that integrate Native American culture and history, often teaching through songs and storytelling, empowering Native youth, and bringing greater appreciation for cultural diversity to all children in the public school system. She has also traveled widely throughout North, Central, and South America, working for NGOs and the UN, facilitating communication among Indigenous peoples with the intent of protecting and preserving cultural heritage, languages, and homelands. Throughout her work, she has served as a bridge in cross-cultural interactions, encouraging mutual respect and understanding among Native and non-Native communities, educators, and environmental groups. Keith Agawa is a graduate of the University of Washington's Creative Writing Program and is author of the novel Mad Child Running. Agawa's extensive experience in the fields of children and family services and Indian education reform has provided him with both inspiration and insight into his subject matter. Igawa has been awarded several artist grants, including the Arts Up grant through the Seattle Arts Commission, which was used to conduct a series of writing workshops for Native youth in the Seattle area. Kimberly Johnson is an award-winning novelist and vice provost for undergraduate education and student success at the University of Oregon. Her recent book, This Is My America, is a best-selling novel that explores racial injustice against innocent Black men who are criminally sentenced and the families left behind to pick up the pieces. 2021 accolades include the Pacific Northwest Book Award, YALSA Top 10 Best Fiction, NPR Concierge Best Books, Malka Penn Human Rights Award for Children's Literature, and the ILA Notable Books for a Global Society. The novel has also been selected for the Spirit of Texas and Humanities of Tennessee 8 through 12 grade reading programs for their respective states. This Is My America will soon be adapted as an HBO Max series. Debbie Reese is a former school teacher and assistant professor in American Indian Studies and is widely known for her website, American Indians in Children's Literature. Founded in 2006, the site has been instrumental in shifting children's literature into anti-racism and offers critical analysis of representations of Native and Indigenous peoples throughout the history of the genre. Reese is tribally enrolled at Nambe. Scholarship is used widely in education, English, and library science courses throughout the US and Canada. Lastly, our moderator, Betsy Wheeler, is a professor of English and founding director of Disability Studies minor at the University of Oregon. She researches and teaches intersectional representations of disability and race in young adult and children's literature, comics, speculative fiction, and public policy. Her 2019 book, Handyland, The Crippest Place on Earth, analyzes the politics of disability in public space in contemporary British and American young adult and children's literature. Choice selected Handyland as an outstanding academic title of the year. Her scholarship has appeared in the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies, Literary Afrofuturism in the 21st Century, Disability Studies and the Environmental Humanities, Children's Literature Quarterly, and Constructing the Mother, Narratives of Disability, Motherhood, and the Politics of Normal. So without further ado, let's welcome our speakers for what will prove to be just an amazing conversation. Thank you so much.
Greetings to all of you. So very glad to have you with us today. And I'd like to start with a question for all of you. What did you read when you were growing up?
I'll go ahead and jump in. Is that all right? So I was lucky to have two older sisters and a mom who read to me constantly as a kid. We didn't have a television, which wasn't actually unusual at that time. When we did finally get one, it was a black and white TV, if that kind of gives you a sense of the era. So yeah, so they read to me a lot. When I started, when I was old enough to start gravitating towards books myself, there was a lot of Grimm's fairy tales, a lot of fairy tales, and in particular books about animals, nonfiction, zoology, basically. And then as I got a little bit older, around like late grade school, I read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, which had a huge impact on me. And then it evolved from there. But in childhood, that kind of sums it up.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Kim, can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, I mean, I remember more of grade school. I was always a really big reader, filled my stacks and stacks of books when I would go to the Eugene Public Library. That was the place that I got all my books. And I gravitated towards things that were mystery or thrillers or spooky and scary. And I've reflected a lot on that. And a lot of those reasons are because it didn't matter what identity the characters were. For me as a young person, my goal was to be scared or to solve the story. And I think it really was an absence of representation that sort of had me be attracted to at least fast-paced stories for that. And so a lot of that kind of stuff was what I was reading as a young person.
Yeah, I've also heard people say that I've heard people of color say that they liked science fiction for the same reason, because the future belongs to everyone. Let's see, Debbie?
Well, I grew up in the 60s, and so in terms of Native representation, zero. There wasn't anything like that. It was the time when Nancy Larrick's article came out in the Saturday Review. It was titled "The All-White World of Children's Books." So there were people documenting the absence of Native and people of color going back a long, long time. So I didn't have anything that looked anything like me when I was growing up. There were plenty of books that I remember reading, including one called, wouldn't you know, Little Owl Indian, that I read in first grade. That was his skin was so red it glowed, and there was a fire, and he was in all the stereotypical modes. I mean, the crossed arms, the hand up to say how. I do remember that, and of course, that was not representation. That was a problematic book. So anyway, I read a lot. Nothing that looked like me, but that's much better now.
Sorry, I just wanted to add. Yeah, I didn't address that part of it. Similar experience with me. I didn't, because I was a kid, I wasn't really seeking out, works that represented our family's culture. But I do remember when encountering it, it was the absolute cliche, stereotypical. Chino and I are of Pacific Northwest heritage. Our tribes are Coast Salish, and when you did encounter, native themed stories, they were pretty much entirely written by non-native authors, and they always had that the plains cliches. So if it was a native story, you were seeing plains signifiers, and that wasn't even accurate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just for our audience who may not be familiar, what are the plains signifiers that you might that someone might look for?
Horses, war bonnets, like Debbie said, the stoic Indian with the folded arms and the broken English and the lack of emotion, peace pipes.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody's on Twitter, they could go on Twitter today and look for my Twitter handle, Deb Reese, because a parent posted a photo today of Clifford, the big red dog, happy-go-lucky Clifford, in his Indian chief costume, because that is how he is in Clifford's Halloween. And he's got a big headdress on. He's got war paint. Normally happy Clifford is suddenly stern. His eyebrows are very different. So it's all packed in there.
That's current this year?
It's still out, yeah. When that page was first published in that book, Clifford was a zebra. That was fine. But then in 1986, they decided, well, let's change that, and we'll make him be an Indian. So they changed it.
Yeah.
And then they made another change later on where they said, oh, we should probably call him a chief. So now he's an Indian chief. Oh, and yes, it is still for sale.
And you live in Champaign-Urbana, where there's the chief mascot. So Kim, what about you? Did you see you and your family's identities represented?
I'll head it up to Chinoa. I spoke a little bit. No, I did not see any representation until I was in college. Was the first time. But I know Chinoa. I'm sure you have more to say.
Sure.
Thank you, Kim. Yeah, I was just thinking back too as the other speakers were sharing their experiences, and I just remember a lot of the books that we read. I just remember being asked to read Charlotte's Web in the 4th grade, and loved that book. And it was mainly animal books, and then books that had characters that had supernatural powers. That was what I was always drawn to. And I don't remember having much representation at all until, I was really thinking about it as all of you were talking and realizing, most of the books we read were Hans Christian Andersen. I remember Watership Down. I remember some of the first books that I saw that were native stories were like Storm Boy and Frog Girl, and that was written by a non-native man. And so not our own people telling our own stories, but, and then we had, I remember telling my brother one time in our history book, they were talking about native people, and it actually said women are called squaws. And so again, you have these giant, just complete derogatory terms, and then also just inaccurate. And considering, it wasn't there at all. So I think my experience was similar to what the other panelists are saying.
Mm-hmm. And so I'd like to know how you all made the leap into literature for young readers yourselves, and how did you end up in that particular sphere?
Let's see. So, so I, I was always compelled to do adult fiction when I started seriously writing. But I was working for a nonprofit for urban Indian families called United Indians. And I was doing crisis intervention and casework and foster care licensing, specifically with Seattle natives. And I ended up for the therapy section, I ended up writing a short play, and it was for the Talking Circle, which is a form of therapy, a talking circle for kids, and specifically kids who'd been abused, and predominantly kids who'd been sexually abused. And so the play was about a little girl who goes on an adventure. She's been abused and she's carrying this secret, and she goes on an adventure through the woods where she's just stricken. And as she encounters all these animals, she befriends them. It's a contemporary story, but it has the traditional native storytelling feel of animals as these other sentient beings you communicate with. And so the gist of the story, the kind of the lessons and the themes, is the importance of sharing what's happened to you with people who are trustworthy, good friends, good family members, etc. And then how that also contributes to healing, but then also taking that next step of being of strength, of finding strength and being a person who stands up for others who can't necessarily stand up for themselves. And so it was really specific to addressing abuse. But then years later, Shanoa and I were talking about the story because it meant a lot to her too, the story. And we were like, what if we, adjusted the story so it wasn't specific to that, but it still carried all those important values and messages about, friendship and reaching out to loved ones and communication and taking a stand on behalf of of protecting people who can't protect themselves. And I think we also had some environmental messages in there, Shnoa. So we set about rewriting that story and illustrating it together, and we called it Tawny Search for the Heart, and we ended up self-publishing that. So it was. So I would say it was a sense of responsibility. I was compelled to start to enter that arena of communicating to children through stories. And then recently, with the Whale Child, a similar thing where that sense of responsibility. The Whale Child is an environmental story, so it's a young whale named Shiny, who is, after he's born, his mother takes him on this journey through the world's oceans. And in addition to showing him the beauty of the world and teaching him how to survive, she shows him all the negative things that are happening environmentally because of humans. And so he's chosen by the spirit of the sea to become a human boy for a short visit on the shores of the Pacific Northwest. And there he teaches a young Coast Salish native girl about, as they go on a journey throughout her homeland. And he shows her these things she wasn't aware of, these negative things that are happening environmentally because of people. So that this journey for us has just expanded to, again, that responsibility of, these are heavy topics. It's a difficult discussion, and kids are kids, but it's subject matter that can't be ignored. They're going to face it. They're going to live it. And so we were just compelled to make sure we reach out to kids and in a age appropriate way at least introduce them to these difficult subjects. And I know that Shnoa has a really good perspective on this as well, and probably has things to add to that.
Yeah. So with how we got involved in writing children's books, I remember first with Tawny Search for the Heart, just the stories that our great grandma would share with us. And I remember just feeling really sad a lot of times and feeling like those stories were not really represented and those times were not here anymore. And there was just a feeling that I wanted to remember what it must have felt like for her in her life and the way that things were back then, even though there were a lot of hardships that were going on too with the boarding schools and such. And so we put that story together, and the earth is always a part of that story. And I think as Native people, we have a specific perspective that's extremely important at this time, at all times, because it reminds us that we're interconnected. We are not individuals and separate from the natural world, the earth, and all of the elements, and one another, and the things that give us life on a very basic level each and every day. And I feel that as Native people, we have this role to be helpful in making changes that we need to make as a human race if we're all going to be here in the future. It's kind of like that is one of the most important messages, and I just feel as though the teachings that Keith mentioned in The Whale Child are the little girl that's in the story has those teachings within her own people, and the stories are told to her about how you respect life, and what you take from the earth is you offer gratitude, you give your thanks, and you take only what you need, and you take care of those things. You don't take more than you need. It's not there for making a profit. It's there to recognize the cycle of life and our part in it, that we are to be caretakers of the earth. And I feel like that message has really hasn't been listened to. And the diversity of people in general, of all different cultures, that life has been explained through one lens, and we're missing the rich cultural heritage of so many different peoples on this planet that have deep wisdom that comes from their ancestors, from thousands of years of experience of living in their own lands, and even the people who've been taken from their lands to other lands. These stories are really important. You open up any person's heart and you hear their life story, and every single story is amazing. Even the parts that are traumatic, even the parts that are heroic, in everything about it, it's essential that we have the truth for our children today. And so far, the truth hasn't really been told, and the truth is coming out now. And it's time to bring in all the different voices from all the backgrounds and perspectives and cultures and languages, and those stories. That is the richness of what it means to be a human. We have so much beauty there. So I feel like it is, like my brother said, it's a responsibility. You use your voice to speak the truth and to stand up for what's needed, and to do it in a positive way so that we can have an engaging conversation and not be pushing people away, but bring it in and say, okay, how can we really make this something good here?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I like about both the three of your creative work, is that it talks about the heaviest things that you can imagine, but it does it through the beauty of children's literature and the appeal of children's literature. And I think all three of you manage that balance very well. So Debbie, what was your journey like on the way to American Indians in children's literature?
Well, I grew up on the reservation in Nambe-Wingate, and we were raising my daughter there too, and then went to graduate school in Illinois, and that mascot was everywhere, and trying to understand why people had such a grasp on it, why they were so emotional about it. I had been a classroom teacher and had lots of children's books and was always interested in children's books and reading. So I started looking at them because I was in a research university. So I started looking at what is it in children's books that might be feeding this embrace. And that's right away I found Clifford the Big Red Dog in that headdress, and Berenstain Bears Go to Camp, where they're all dressed up like Indians. And it was just like one example after another. children's books that fed them stereotypes, and those books are given to children, to young children, by people who care about them, by people who love them. So you have layers of emotion mixed in with all of that, and so wanting to understand that and wanting to document how prevalent it is, because that's what my blog was doing. It's like, here's another example, here's another one, because people really have to know it's there. I do a lot of workshops with teachers and librarians, and one of the big pieces that we spend time on is Little House on the Prairie. I have them read segments from that book. They don't remember how bad those passages are, and they feel very upset about that now that they're adults and thinking about, wow, I just gave that book out yesterday. So calling attention to the problematic images in there is very important. We can't just say, read these books by Chenoweth and Keith. We have to say, look at Little House on the Prairie, because what Native writers report is that teachers and librarians don't believe that they and the Native characters in their books are real because they don't match the other image. So we really have to take a lot of time to get rid of the stereotypes so that the truth can have the light that it needs.
That is so interesting. They don't believe that they're real because of this constant repetition. Wow.
And relegated to history, to ancient history.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And often just these little mentions in a book that's mostly about something else. So it's almost subliminal.
Absolutely.
And sorry, I don't want to go out of turn, but just when you were talking, I just realized something that I hadn't thought about or remembered until you said it. So I loved the Berenstain Bears as a kid, and so Chanel and I grew up in schools that were pretty much 80 to 90% white, probably closer to 90. And I remember when we would encounter things like that, like when you mentioned how they were dressed up as Indians, when I would be confronted with those, because whenever that occurred in children's literature back then, the people pretending to be natives always became more simple. They became kind of slow and dumb, and the whole stoic Indian thing and all that, and they all the signifiers like the headdresses and stuff. But I remember being really embarrassed, and it would catch me off guard because I was a fan of those books. But I remember in classrooms, 90-something% white, when those would come up, I would become really self-conscious and be embarrassed. And I didn't think of that until you just said that.
It's quite stunning and quite remarkable and terrifying that when I'm talking with teachers about Little House on the Prairie, and I say, did you know that it has this, the only good Indian is a dead Indian phrase in there 3 times? And they're like, no, but that's the way they thought back then. And I said, who thought that way? Who are you talking about? Because certainly Native people who were in Indian territory did not think that way about each other or about people in their families. So pushing very hard on looking carefully at what we're saying is okay with the words that we choose when we're defending a book like Little House on the Prairie. It's hard work, but necessary.
So Debbie, since you were talking about Laura Ingalls Wilder, could you talk a little bit about the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award?
Yeah, so that I've been writing and talking about that book for decades. And a few years ago, I learned that the American Library Association was going to start looking at some of the names of the named awards that they give to people in children's literature. And that was the first one they were going to look at. And I thought, you people have no idea what you're trying to do. And so they were going to have the proposal, and they did bring the proposal forward. And I thought, okay, good luck. And then it actually got approved that it's going to start a task force to look at that. And so the task force was going to report back. And I thought, okay, yeah, big deal. And so I was at that ALA meeting when the task force was presenting its findings. I walked into that room. It was a room of white people and white presenting people. And I thought, forget it. No matter what the task force says, it's going to go down. And they listened to the task force findings, and then they voted, and they said, change the name. And I was shocked. I was totally shocked. I could not believe it. I just started looking around like, I can't believe that just happened. So I was surprised that the proposal was accepted. I was surprised that the task force findings were accepted. And then the ALA was like ready. This is one of their shining moments when that night they changed it on their website everywhere. It suddenly was no longer the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award. And of course, the world went kablooey. People were very upset. How dare anybody do that? But it was an important change, an important moment.
And I think so much of that is down to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Kim, how did you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that is so fascinating about this work in children's literature is the places that people want to hold on to history and the places they want to forget. And that's really the work that we do in wanting to tell our stories, and the work that Debbie does in showing evidence after evidence after evidence of things that are wrong and should be sort of taken away, but people who still want to continue to sort of hold on to these old pieces. The curation of that is always very fascinating to me. I began really being interested in children's lit about 10 years ago when I started just reading it again, and reading this sort of new trickling of stories that began to have a different kind of representation that I never had. And when I really started reading, I just was grabbing anything that had anything with diverse without even any sort of like, who is the identity of the person writing it? It was different than I had. And I've been so fortunate in this sort of the early part of when I went back into literature is that it sparked an interest in me in wanting to write and just pick up all the stories that actually had been in my head that I had never put down to paper, because I never saw myself as a writer. I wasn't someone who wrote short stories. It just was something that I knew that was, I would tell stories on an oratorial level. I would, tell stories in my head, but never put them down. And it really was the representation for me that felt like there was a space for me to be able to tell stories and tell stories in different kinds of ways that we've done. And now I've been able to really curate my interests to things that are whole part of my interest. Where before it was decades, you would sort of have to like take a book and try to keep what was good with it and then throw away all the bad. I'm so grateful that I don't have to be in that kind of place for that. And I also just want to recognize Debbie's work, because it doesn't just impact Native and Indigenous communities and the broader scale. I followed Debbie for years, and I have learned so much on the analysis and how to look at it across other identities and communities, and thinking about how I approach work, how I approach what I read and select. And I think just a carefulness with how I do that. And so Debbie, I mean, your influence, it's broad reaching across the diverse communities, because of how, I wish that within the Black community, we had our own site that was very, very robust. We don't have that because there's been such bad representation that just continues to be there. That we, still have in schools, and there's very limited change, in a lot of those areas. So yeah, that's really what drew me to tell the stories. And working in a university, I work with young people. I work with young people who inspire me every single day in the way that they use their voice, and the way that they take on their interests and challenges and their own activism. And me being a young activist growing up, helped me to believe that I actually could learn how to write as an adult, in my 30s, and now I'm in my early 40s, that I actually could do what young people do all the time, which is constantly learning and changing and growing.
Yes, I love that about being at a university as well, just having that impetus to keep learning. So Kim, could you tell a little bit about maybe some particular connections with young people at the university or with communities through your activism that have sparked your writing in some way?
Yeah, so there's about 2% African American students, staff, faculty at the University of Oregon, which is slightly higher than within my particular community. And so when we think about engagement and support, it's not just about my work and my leadership that I do. It's about those students that I want to support out, when issues happen within the classroom or on campus, or, just creating a community environment. And so, a lot of my activism as a young person really was reinvigorated by working and supporting and mentoring young students, young activists who are, navigating, the university in a lot of different ways. And, This Is My America, I really started writing it after late 2014, early 2015, where Black Lives Matter became something that was shared across the country, across the world. And it's been touched on a lot of issues that I have had my own activism and, done a lot of research, in particular nonfiction, on African American history, politics, and law, and the sort of the intersections of our criminal justice system. And a lot of the conversations in the media on Black Lives Matter was very singular. It was about the bodies, not the people, the bodies that were impacted, Black bodies, which is the story of our country. It's always about the bodies and the blood. And I really wanted to sort of take that energy that a lot of young people that I was working with had, and wanted to make change and write a story that had an activist at heart. That was, that she wasn't, there were things that happened to her family where, they were victims of societal things, but she was the heroine in the story, that leads change. I also wanted to expand the conversation about police brutality and have it be about the larger systemic issue, which is racism in our country, that impacts every element of our society. And that's really how I really approached the story, was sort of combining my love of mysteries and thrillers, which is the thing that I loved when I was growing up. It was like the books that I read, and the activism and social justice that really has fueled my life and continues to be things that I engage with.
Yeah, that's one of the things I loved when I started reading This Is My America. I'm like, oh, it's a mystery story, and it's got a romance in it too. So it's got all this. It's. I feel like there's some things that are written for kids that you can tell are supposed to be good for them, but they're not really engaging, with the genre. So I loved that it's a page turner. So what were some of the strategies, Kim, that you used when you were writing the book, in terms of wanting to foreground voices and agency and not just bodies and this heroine and larger issues? Like, what were some kind of artistic choices you made?
Yeah, I mean, you really spoke to it in a second, by just saying that there was romance in the story. It's just humanizing characters. It's having depth associated where, that there might be sort of hard elements or things that are happening, but, we are all complex people that are able to sort of manage life in a lot of different ways. And when there's pain, there's also joy. I think about when I work with my students who are, they're marching, or they're organizing, or they're putting together a club, they're doing all these things. And, the next day they might be in my office crying about a breakup or upset about a bad grade that they had, that they can be all of those things. And so a lot of that was about humanizing it. I also, wanted to, as I was balancing those, I really wanted to show the families and the people who are impacted. I think, oftentimes in young adult, it's something that you don't it's not necessarily encouraged per se. They really want you to focus, as you should, on the young characters in your story that are sort of appropriate for the age. But for many of our communities, family members, elders, the community around you are just as much a part of your life. And to tell a story without that being there isn't accurate to me. And my story was not accurate to me as a young person about who is in my life. And so I really tried to sort of bridge all of those elements in the story, on top of the fast fast-paced nature, of the book, to model different layers of sort of the very obvious level of racism. Okay, KKK, cross burning, yes, that is racism, to the microaggressions and the interactions within her community, passing by and really explicitly sharing what the impact of that and how she sort of felt about those experiences of just being on alert all the time, and what that does to your body and your feeling, in that way. And so really was bridging all of those together to tell the story.
That what you just said about the family, and the mother's an important character, and the little sister and the brother, makes me think of what Chanel was saying about the knowledge of the elders. And I have been thinking, in traditional English and American children's literature for more than a century, much more than a century, those are stories. Often the model is it's stories about kids in their own kid world, that they're an orphan, or they're in some other ways you have to get rid of the family. So it's the kid on their own, or it's all just kids. And I've been thinking more and more that that's a white thing. And that it seems to me, this is just my informal survey, that that children's lit about kids and families of color in the US anyway tends to be much more incorporating a multi-generational picture and pictures of kids within their families. So I wanted to know more about why you think that is, or maybe you don't think that is.
I just want to say that's that's a really good observation. That's totally true. That's absolutely fairly consistent throughout. Kids in their own world, surviving without family, or on an adventure and family doesn't seem to really exist. I never thought of that. Sorry, Chanel, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's definitely the case, and having multi-generational influence on children is a part of our culture, and a part of a lot of our cultures, most cultures, I think, and so there's different levels of understanding the role of the parents and the grandparents and the aunts and the uncles and the siblings, and there is, I feel like that's one of the things that were broken through the whole colonization process. Because I think that at that time you could see how powerful the family was, and how powerful the community was, and the love and the strength that was there. And in order to cut that strength and to cut that power and that force that our people have, that you had to break it up. And that's why the children were taken away and taken to boarding schools, and the languages were cut off. I was telling Danielle earlier that I was just thinking about it. We're kind of put into this really simplistic categorization, even as, asking, okay, what tribe are you? And saying, I'm an enrolled Lummi member, but I'm also Clallam. And great grandma said, we're Clallam and Klamath and Flathead. But yet in this system that we're in now, I'm just a Lummi. I mean, not just a Lummi, but I'm Lummi. But it just makes the story like this, when the story has all of this experience and all of this background that is not acknowledged because it doesn't fit into the picture that we're trying to present. And so I think that that is the respect of the elders. I want to say the respect of the elders, and the respect of understanding where our teachings come from, and the storytelling, the oral tradition, and the art of storytelling, and the spiritual ceremonial aspect of storytelling, and how those are what we call the teachings, not the school and the modern school, but the teachings are the stories, because the teachings carry the wisdom of thousands of years of experience about human nature and our interaction with the natural world. And so much of this wisdom is not a part of our school system or literature, children's literature. And I feel like that allows us to forget who we are in relationship to everything. That makes us, that kind of is an intentional way of making people forget. Because when you remember who you are and you remember who your foundation and your root and where you come from, and the wisdom of your people who came before you, who allowed you through their life to be here, they brought you here. You know, we didn't just arise out of nothing. Then you have a whole different respect for life and for everything in life, and for other people and for other perspectives, and the wisdom it's missing, you know, when you leave out all the generations and the relations with the families and the community. It's true.
Putting the pieces back into place.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, and in Tawny's search, so the little girl, her grandmother is the center of her universe. She's the one who raises her, and she passes away, and coming to terms with that is part of the reason for Tawny's journey. But Shano is a really good illustrator, and I remember her telling me, she said, I'm painting this star when I do night scenes. I'm not sure how many paintings that this is present in, but she said, I'm going to paint this little star up in the sky, and that'll represent her grandmother, to show that her grandmother is still with her and guiding her, and it shows that connection to her ancestry. And I thought, remember, Shnoa, I thought that was really neat.
Mm-hmm. See, Kim or Debbie, would either of you like to?
I just like that you said how white it is. Because it is. And it feeds this idea, you know, of the brave American conquering all and getting rich, with no regard for actually how did you get there and who helped you along the way. It feeds a false narrative. It feeds this mess that we're in.
That's right. Like, and who built the White House you live in, and whose land was that? And that's right. If you're just the boxcar kids and you just show up and it's your boxcar.
Who suffered for your comfort?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm really glad I got the chance to ask that burning question of mine to the experts. Let's talk some about what's going on now in literature by authors of color and about kids and families of color. Like, what kind of, Kim, I'd love to know what conversations you're in with other writers, and Debbie, what are you seeing and reviewing and thinking about?
We are in a really incredible moment in time. It's not enough, but the energy and the support from communities that are, BIPOC communities. There's so many books that I have been able to just read, and not even just specifically, stories by Black authors. And when I think about stories by Black authors, I have went into new lanes that I have never read before. Some of my favorite books that I have read have been, and I mostly read young adult. I mean, I just love that space so much right now because there's so much being done. But I never was about time travel. And I love Justin Reynolds' opposite, as always, about time travel. Keith Lehman's Long Division. I'm jumping into fantasy. I didn't know who Octavia Butler was. As a younger, person reading, no one told me, about her work. And now we have all of these different sci-fi and fantasy writers. I mean, it just really is amazing to see the growth of stories, and the network and the network that's a building and helping each other. I mean, so I was a 2020 debut, that, all my dreams and hopes after working so hard, I finally was going to have my book published, and the pandemic hit, and it felt like my world was going to be crushed, that I wasn't going to have this opportunity. And the support of not only the other, 15 Black young adult authors that had books that I connect with and had a relationship with, but people who were before us to help us and talk us through the industry and who to work with and what do we need to watch out for. This sort of passing down that we saw in this sort of the early Black arts movement of Black literary artists who were sort of really increasing. And the other for me that is really, really exciting is that I read. I mostly read diverse authors. Like that is what I read. I read now. I feel like I spent 30 years of not doing that. That I want to spend the next 30 years of my life doing that. Not exclusively is what I do, but probably majority of what I read. And I've learned so much by other authors who write within the genre of stories that I like to write, but are diverse authors that before I would have never been able to read from. Looking at Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Boulley, like me writing complex stories that talk about family and have a thriller mystery component. I get to read, her work, coming out as a debut. I get to read June Her, who is writing Korean 14th century mysteries. I get to jump into these things, and all of that I think is just so exciting because as a writer, I now have other models that I can see about storytelling, people doing things in different ways that we have never really been able to see. Because I think it's one thing having the identity and knowing your community, but how do you actually verbalize it and write it down and tell it when we have been so indoctrinated with white supremacy, with people telling our stories, whether it's in books or in media and television and film. It is so difficult to not have that impact your work. And so you can see, I'm just as a writer, it is so exciting to have so much work that I can touch. That's new and changing and breaking paradigms that we haven't seen. So yeah, it's a marvel right now to be in this space, and I really hope that it continues because our future generations of students are going to be majority. We'll be the majority. We are the world majority, but in the United States, we will be the majority.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so exciting. So, Debbie?
Yeah, so I'm going to show you a book, Sisters of the Never Sea by Cynthia Leitich Smith. She is a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation. And one of the exciting things that I see developing in children's literature more and more, the ones that are written by Native people, is they use the word nation somewhere in their book, whether they're talking about themselves so that a teacher can say, oh yeah, nation. These guys, oh yeah, they were nations before the United States was a nation. Trying to, get the factual knowledge about who we are into children's books, and then so that teachers can share it. So Sisters of the Never Sea is her retelling of Peter Pan. It is an amazing story for that reason, because it is her telling a retelling of the Peter Pan story, but it's also good. I'm trying to do this backwards like a mirror. Okay, here is this is Lily. Lily is a Black Muskogee character, so that's a new development that Cynthia is doing especially well, bringing forward Black Indian characters. So Lily is Black Muskogee, and later in the story, we're going to, when they get to the island, we meet a character who is Black Seneca. So that has to happen more, and I'm glad that she's doing that. And the other thing that needs to happen more is books like this one. This is such a task for me trying to get this in the right space. This is Sharice's Big Voice. It's by Sharice Davids, who is currently the congressperson from Kansas. But you know what's in here too? That she's a lesbian. It's in here. It's on the page. And she talks about being a little kid and how the kids around her were saying, "What are you?" And she asked her mom, "What am I?" Because she was clearly different in appearance from the other children that she was going to school with. And her mom said, "We're of the Ho-Chunk Nation." And I'm like, yes, there's the word nation. Eric Gansworth is doing that in his books. His book, it's right here. I bought that. I did not design this, but if I ever get out of here, in this book, he is a Onondaga character named Lewis who makes friends with a white guy named George, and George's dad loves the same kind of music that Eric's character does. And you see the headphones here, a big signifier about what you find in the books, lots of music. And there's going to be a concert in Canada, and they live in New York, and so they're going to cross the border to go to Canada to see the concert. But when they're getting to the border, Mr. Haddonfield, that's George's dad, he says, "Do you have your passport, son?" And he says, "Yes, sir, right here." And he pulls out his tribal ID. And Mr. Haddonfield says, "I don't think that's going to work." But you know what? It does work because of the treaty that his nation has. The border guards know that the people of these nations can cross that border using their tribal IDs. So this was set in around the 70s, but this too is wonderful. So when he pulls up to the guard station and the guard says, what is it the guard says? Like ID and nation or something like that. And the father and the son, the white father and son, say where they're from and where they were born. And Lewis says, Onondaga Nation. You know, it's just like, it's just so much pride and so much joy and so much information and told really well. So I'm excited about seeing sovereignty and nationhood in children's books that are being written by Native writers who are sticking to their own communities, to their own nations, because that's what they know. That's what they know really well, and they can bring that forward. That's
really important too, isn't it? Is people writing about what they know and not appropriating what they don't.
Chanel, I remember Dad telling us we could use our tribal ID for the Canadian border. I remember him telling me that, the Treaty of Point Elliott.
Yep.
Go ahead.
You got to make a story about that.
He said, you know, you can just show them your tribal ID. We can go back and forth. That's all you need. Yeah, it's true. It might confuse people and they have to look into it, but it's true.
That word nation is such a claim. I was just actually saying that to my students the other day, that it's sovereignty, it's legality, it's there's just so much attitude and claiming and taking up space that goes into that word. So it's historically accurate, but it's also, it's an argument at the same time. Hang on just a minute, because I wanted to ask you, Debbie, what was the name of that author of If I Ever Get Out of Here?
Eric Gansworth. I can try this again. There we go. Eric Gansworth. And he has 3 books. This is the first one. There's the second one came out a couple of years ago, and this year his new book is a memoir about his life and his family's life. So when Keith and Shannon were talking about family, that's very much a part of that story, because his grandparents went to Carlisle Indian School, and that's in that book. Mm-hmm. So I definitely recommend that one too.
Mm-hmm. So Keith and Shannon, what are you guys reading, viewing, talking about?
That's a tough one for me to answer. You're talking in terms of like interacting with other Native writers and sharing ideas and that type of thing.
Yeah, or just your own reading, or.
Yeah, lately I haven't been able to read for quite a while with my job. It's job, and then when I can write, I write. So so my answer to that one's always been kind of disappointing, like similar to the question about interaction with other writers. I remember writers groups were a big thing. Maybe they still are when I was like college age and beyond. But I'm definitely on the introvert side. And so I always just kind of, would experience something in life and be affected by it, moved by it, angered by it, what have you. And then I would pursue that as, the subject matter for what I was writing. I've never really been a person who does a lot of, interacting with people who are doing similar things to me, other writers. But yeah, sorry about with recent
That's
books,
okay.
with children's books, it's been quite a while, and I could be spacing it out. I probably have read stuff in the past couple of years, but yeah.
Before we move on to another topic, I would just like to put in a plug, and I thought of this because Debbie had brought up that we had a character who was Native and a lesbian, that I wanted to bring up intersectionality and put in a plug for a couple of books. My field is disability in children's literature, which are overwhelmingly white representations. So I'm always looking for intersectional representation. So a couple of books that I'm loving these days, and intersections with queerness. And I've got three recent books on my list. There's Mark Oshiro's Anger is a Gift, which is also about police brutality, and it's with a queer Latinx main character. Day Al Mohammed's fantasy work, like the Labyrinth's Archivist, has a main character who's a detective who is blind and is also queer. And then I really love Adib Khorram's Darius the Great is Not Okay, which is about a kid who is half white, half Persian, American kid who goes back to visit the family in Iran, and all those. So Marco Shiro's main character is dealing with depression and anxiety, and so is Odip Horam's main character, and they're great books, and it's like you've hit the jackpot because there's just so much intersectionality going on. What are some of the things, I guess I'd like to start with Debbie on this. What are some of the things that you look for if you're going to recommend a book?
I look for books that are written by Native writers who are telling stories of their people. I think that's really important because it's hard to talk about being who you are without, in some way, tapping into your spiritual and religious teachings. And those we do protect very carefully because they've been so exploited over time. And if you are trying to tell some other nation's stories, you don't know what those safeguards are, and you will violate them. And we have seen that. So I look for Native writers who are writing within their own space of knowing. And I look for evidence of sovereignty or the word nation in the book. I look for present day, because we do have the large body of books that non-Native people have written have been set in the past. And so I look for ones that are set in the present day. So those are some of the key things that I keep an eye out for.
What about you, Kim? What do you look for?
Yeah, I'm really focused on people who write from their identity. We just have so many talented authors right now that we should be supporting, and it's just so much more authentic to me, and I feel safer. I've gotten to the point where if I don't feel safe enough that I have to sort of protect myself, that I don't end up being interested in. I like to read broadly. I like to support BIPOC authors and learn from them, and I try to do my best research in the other areas about what are other authors of that identity saying, because sometimes things can be off, and I would never want to sort of support something that isn't. So I do look to that. Now I like to test myself on different kinds of things. I mean, that's the thing that I'm actually really, really fascinated by, is reading retellings and fantasy and time travel changes and all these other things that I just have never been able to enjoy in doing it with diverse characters. Intersectionality is key for me too. It doesn't have to be there. I mean, but it is something that I do like to see, especially when you have a diverse cast of characters. So, if I'm reading Kaysen Callender's book, their representation, that's there, has all these different layers. And to me, that not having seen that before, I'm drawn to understanding the diaspora really broadly. And so I think those are the things that I'm really interested in. And I guess the last thing is that really the complexity of the characters that feel, the third, fourth dimensional, that they're, that they feel like people that I know, and not caricatures, is really important to me.
I'm curious also to know, Kim, about other authors for young readers who are working with some of the same themes of police violence, for instance, that you are looking at, and just how you think about, like, what are some moments that you really value in other people's work, things that you've learned from, things that you think are important in writing about those issues?
Yeah, I mean, I like to say I like to read broadly, because I don't like stories just to be about pain and incarceration and all those other kinds of things. But I am also very much into contemporary works and reality, because I'm grounded in that. I read the histories of people. I read the current issues of people, and so it's harder for me to actually step away and dream in fantasy, and I force myself to do that because I need a break in order to do that. And so, I love the work of Jason Reynolds. He has really wide-ranging work. He has just a beautiful way of just his writing. It feels real. He's always talking about, it has to sound good. It has to sound good, when he's writing, and that you could sort of break these sort of other paradigms. And, even his work. So, he's known for All American Boys, which is, a co-authored book that he wrote that was dealing with police brutality, but he has A Long Way Down, which is, a novel in verse, and that's a sort of a very different way. And so I love sort of approaching things in different ways. Ibi Zebora and Yusuf Salem's Punching the Air was another incarceration story that was also a novel in verse. And that, again, for me, I think I'm just excited about new areas that I haven't touched, because those are actually things I typically wouldn't have read that I've now been able to do. And there's some new, authors that are debuts that have books that have came out. Pam Harris has a book, when they look like us. Sorry, terrible titles and names. That's a really great book. I mean, there's just so much out there that I think reading broadly is a really great way to see what you like and don't like, and I think understand people in a lot of different ways, beyond the sort of like the very narrow view that we have seen for so long.
Yeah.
Can I share a Jason Reynolds story? My critiques draw a lot of fire, so I'm often getting beat to bits in white spaces. and there was a panel at ALA one year, and Jason was on it and I was on it. And when he was speaking, he said, "I just want to say one thing. Debbie Reese is not a troll." And I just like, oh, yay. That's my story.
Well, now I think even more of Jason Reynolds. Well, it looks like it is time for us to move on to the audience's questions. So, and Danielle is going to moderate that. So thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, and off to you, Danielle, and what the audience wants to know.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much again, everybody. This has just been an incredible conversation. So the first question that has come in that I think is really relevant, it's from a future librarian, and she asks, when I get my own library, how should I handle books with misrepresentation? Should they be weeded? Should I put a note in them that states there is misrepresentation? How do we deal with this?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and so I defer to you folks to share your expertise on it. But yeah, so on the one hand, it's something that readers, that people definitely need to know. They need to know that it's not authentic, or that that it's, perpetuating, untrue stereotypes, etc. But then at the same time, I think we need to be able to refer to them to see those views and see how those inaccuracies are in the mainstream, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say it's like with kids, with students. I was on so Seattle Public Schools is teaching our book in the time immemorial curriculum, and they took about 45 minutes, and they went through this training on all these titles and whether or not they were acceptable to be taught to kids for these reasons of inaccuracies and stereotypes and negative imagery. And so with kids, they were making sure that information didn't get to them, that they weren't learning incorrectly. But in the broader sense of society, those books can't disappear, because we need to see what people, not just historically, but some people still, what they're thinking and perpetuating. And I don't know if what I'm saying is making any sense, but it can't be disappeared. But there needs to be that important caveat when it's a teaching tool.
It can be disappeared. I absolutely think that some of those books need not be in a library that circulates to children, because they are doing damage, especially to the Native and children of color who are being misrepresented. And efforts to try to use those in a library so that white kids can learn that those are bad images. All of the weight of that learning is on the back of the Native and children of color, who already have plenty to deal with all the time. So I think it's important that we be careful of what how we're talking about keeping those books. I would not have Little House on the Prairie in a library if I was in a public library today. I wouldn't have it there. And I would have a collection development policy that builds into it some policies in there that say books that have misrepresentations of people of color, Native people, whatever, LGBTQ, all of these problematic depictions. My collection development policy would say this will not be in our library, and this is why. And it would have research backing up why those books are hurtful and harmful, not just to Native kids, but to non-Native kids too. And so then when a book like that was being coming across the list of things to order, I would say nope, and nope, and I would not have it, because there's no need to inflict that on kids. So the answer to that librarian is that you have to build that policy development manual so that you are able to create a library that actually affirms the kids who come to your library.
And I think one piece with that too is that oftentimes it's parents who read these stories and love them, and they're trying to get their kiddos, right, to love reading like in the way that they did. But the lack of representation, there are other options, that are there. And there's so many books that come out. I mean, there's no library that could carry every single children's lit book that's out there in the world. And so I do think careful curation is important, because there is so much that's there. I also think that to help those parents and family members and guardians who are trying to sort of select books and help their kids find books is that you helping sort of like showcase books and categorizing them in very different ways. And I like books by Black authors, books by Native Indigenous authors that cover all kinds of themes, and then but also keeping those books in the section. So if someone loves a thriller or a fantasy, that they can also find that there. And so I think that there's some work that needs to really be done to expand the kinds of books that are that our young people are growing up and thinking, and they're going in their schools with these things that they sort of ingrained and picked up. And there's a lot of work that we can do to help sort of stop what we have always done in history.
Anybody else? Thank you. Those seem like excellent answers. As an archivist and curator, I'm curious, perhaps, to get to Keith's point about not disappearing them, perhaps those are best suited for the archive, for the research librarian, for the adult researcher, and not for children.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, holding a large collection of problematic children's literature has its own challenges, let me tell you. Okay, I'm going to move on to a couple other questions. Let's see. So we have one student. She is doing a BA in Indigenous Nation Studies at PSU and is interested in an MLIS. I don't know, Debbie, you might know, or Kim, or actually any of you. Can you recommend a college doing the best work in decolonization within the library and using an intersectional lens? Anybody have?
University of Washington, I think, is one of the better schools, better information schools in terms of professors. Dr. Sandy Littletree is there, and Cheryl Matoyer has retired from there. But I think that what's happening there is exciting and it's kind of leading the way in terms of library school.
Michelle Martin is there.
Yeah, Michelle Martin is there. So I think that's probably the place that I would recommend she go. There's a program that the program that I got my library science degree is from San Jose State. It formed with San Jose State and American Library Association and some other people working very hard had gotten together the funds to have a cohort of Native people go through the San Jose Library Science degree program. So 19 of us went through that 8 years ago, and they have a new cohort that's starting up soon. And I can't tell you, that was all online. And it was the first time that I had students who were like me going through a coursework. And that was so wonderful that we could come together like the six of us are here doing right now and commiserate about what we had experienced that day in class and strategize about how we could do something different and all that. So having a cohort would be really important.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let me keep going through here. Sorry, I'm just reading through the comments. Limited budget. What are the top picks for a library with very limited resources?
Kim's book.
I know you guys
and Jana's books too. The ones that we have had here tonight for sure.
We have gotten some comments that those are already on order based on this conversation. Okay, let's see. Yeah, and I guess it's just, a question of where to go to when you do have limited resources. I mean, obviously, Debbie, there's your site, which is amazing. Are there other resources out there that you would recommend that people look to when they're trying to gather information about what's coming up and what's happening?
I always hate to give recs because I can't keep up with the things have shifted, but I do recall that We Need Diverse Books had a app around some books, and I think that at least for a while had a really diverse set of books to look at. So that's what I would suggest.
I would too. We Need Diverse Books because they have people who know what they're doing that are there. There's a diverse book group finder app that when that came out, I was like, oh dear, no, please don't do that, because there's some seriously problematic books on that in their finder. But anyway, we need diverse books for sure.
Yeah, it's so important who the recommenders are. There's a site that I use all the time called Disability in Kidlit. And what they have up now is like their all-star best books of all time. And every review on that site is reviewed by someone who shares the disability of the characters in the book. And they're all authors, librarians, and so forth.
Fantastic. That's great. We have another question that just came in. Are there, instead of Little House on the Prairie, read this type of lists or recommendations? Just to be able to point for in schools and public libraries, are there, well, I guess it would probably be diverse books. Are there other places that you might look?
I'll just make one plug for Bethany Moreau, who did she's a Black author who did a retelling of Little House on the Prairie. I haven't read it, so I hate to give Rex if I haven't read it, but she did a retelling from the perspective of Black characters, and I haven't read it yet, but I'm particularly interested to see the angle that she did for that particular book.
All right. Fantastic. All right. I think that is all of our questions coming in from the public. Public, is there anybody else who has anything that they would like to ask of our speakers today? I'm just watching the chat.
I did want to ask Genoa if you had any recommendations of books. I know we kind of jumped into questions, but if you just had recommendations of children's books.
I was like my brother. I haven't been reading that many books lately. I've been doing more storytelling, oral storytelling, and working on a podcast lately. And so just kind of in a whole different angle. So I don't have too much to contribute on that right now. Thanks though, Kim.
Shanoa and Keith, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the oral, because you guys just did a narrated version of your book, right? And I'm just curious to know what that process is like for you and how that differs from the published, the printed piece, to have something that's spoken and has auditory elements to it as well.
So yeah, I'm working on that right now, creating an audiobook, and I just talked to the publishers about it for The Whale Child. And just wanted to have, and I had a vision before we got published about creating a whole nature soundscape to go with it. And also just the heart and the feeling that we felt through writing that story, because it was inspired by one of our family members and a really magical thing that had happened during the birth of this child. And so it was kind of something that had come to me and my brother about that responsibility again to share that story, so that our child could remember how the sacredness of his birth and the purpose of his life. And so I was thinking about having someone else do the narration, and then I was just thinking, well, this is a story that comes from our family, that comes from our heart, and I wanted the opportunity to put that feeling in there, and also just to have children be able to listen to nature, and the sounds of nature, that there's a lot of things that we just kind of overlook and take for granted. And the beauty of the natural surroundings that are with us all the time that we don't even think about. A lot of times when we talk with kids, we talk about, what do you need to survive here on this earth? And a lot of people say, food and family and these kind of common things, but they don't think about the water. They don't think about the air. They don't think about the sun and the moon and the stars and the earth and all of these different aspects of which we are a part, that we are not separate, that we are connected. And so it's just an opportunity to share the story in another way and to put that feeling in through how we feel about this person that we wrote the book to remind him, this is who you are. There's times in your life you're going to go through forgetting, and you're going to struggle, and remember who you are. Remember that you were brought in by the ancestors. They accompanied you here. You are perhaps one of them as you came here. You were with them before you were born, and don't forget, you have an important purpose here. And so, yeah, that's why, we're working on the audiobook now, and hoping that'll be another good way to include the nature and maybe some of the songs to a song too.
I was going to say, yeah.
The rhythm of
You
our prayers, our songs, just that connection to the way that it feels to be able to sing when you can't express yourself in words, maybe that the way your song connects you and the way that it gives you that strength. And so, there'll be a song that'll be connected to that as well.
And you'll be doing the song, right?
Right.
You'll be singing, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, this is a perfect extension of your storytelling, because she has done a lot of the storytelling by the oral tradition, traditional stories.
It actually brings another question actually for Kim, is that you're in the process of translating your book into a mini series, into a series on television. What is that process like for you?
Yeah, I mean it's still very early, so you know they're working on the script, and you know having a writer that I trust work on thinking about, you know, what does a season look like, what does another season look like. So I don't have much to share yet. It's still pretty early, but excited about having it from a visual perspective too as well.
Excellent.
I wanted to add in something about ebooks. They have so much of that advantage of bringing in the oral tradition and the storytelling in an immediate way and the sounds of nature. But in terms of access, they're so important for kids with dyslexia and other learning disabilities, and obviously for blind kids. And something that a mom of a blind kid said to me once was something I'd never thought about, which is that authors describe things in books, that visual descriptions that people don't bother describing in conversation. So listening to ebooks is a way that blind kids could get a kind of education about the world that they can't get from other kinds of things that they're hearing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's
Can I
beautiful.
say something about the oral storytelling, or the words that we're using here tonight? That we're using oral storytelling or traditional stories. We're not saying folklore, and I'm so happy that nobody's saying folklore, because in any library that you go into, native traditional stories are over on the folk tale shelf. They really belong over in religious stories or world religions. If you look at the card catalogs, you'll see that they're cataloged that way too, that a native traditional or creation story is called a folk tale. And no, you will never see the word folk tale applied to a Bible story. You know, Christian Bible doesn't get done that. So that's another area that really needs a lot of work. And so I'm really happy that we're not using that word tonight.
That's something I think about a lot when I teach my fantasy class, because fantasy draws so much on tradition, on storytelling culture, and on previous centuries, and on religious traditions. And so I've really been thinking lately about whose traditions are you drawing from in contemporary fantasy, and books, authors like the Children of Blood and Bone series, and Nalo Hopkinson's work, and Inadio Korafor's books are really doing fantasy speculative fiction that is really drawing on African diaspora traditions, and in wonderful ways.
All right. We have just a couple minutes left. Does anybody have any final thoughts or things that they want to? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to share that, you know, that is a really an area where our sacred knowledge, our traditional wisdom, is one that has had to be protected for so long, because it has been banned, prohibited. You know, people have gone to jail for practicing their ceremonial ways and their spiritual ways, and yet it's having seen many different cultures and experienced many different places on this earth, I realize the depth of wisdom that our ancestors and our elders still hang on to and have preserved for this current generation and for our future generations. And I don't know how it's going to look, but I see that those teachings hold a lot of the answers to the problems that the world is facing today. And that I don't know how that's going to be done, or if it can be done in a way where it's not then taken and done something else with, you know, because that always happens too. But I feel like those places where the truth resides in our teachings are the ones that need to guide the future. That's how I feel about what I've learned from a lot of my elders. I just feel that that's the deepest wisdom of any education that I've ever received. Going to college, studying in any class, the deepest wisdom I've received is sitting in a ceremony with elders and listening to them talk about our relationship and our understanding to this earth and to the universe, actually, and having words within the language that talk about understanding that goes beyond science, that I think some of the quantum physicists are starting to see, but that our languages are really important. Our language holds the wisdom of thousands of years of that relationship and understanding the world that we live in and the plants that have provided for us in food and medicine, and those are the things that we need to preserve and protect. And so how are we going to do this? Because we have to come out and we have to share some of these things with our children of all backgrounds, because I think children understand. I think they understand these things. It's the parents or maybe the older people in their life that I don't think children are born into the world with racism. I think it's applied to them as they grow up. And I feel like if we could talk with the kids and find some way to create respect across the cultures and see that together as human beings, we hold the answers that we all need as a human race, that it's respecting one another and it's listening to one another. One of the things that gave me a really good feeling recently was our high school up by Lummi. The principal there, I guess she's about to retire, but she asked our tribe to create a land acknowledgement, and we do the land acknowledgement now. And in some places it becomes just, okay, we have to say this tribe, and then it kind of just goes from there. It just kind of goes flat. But here they spent time to talk about the story about this land that the high school is on now, and the things that have happened in recent history, the things that have happened in ancient history, and that the history is a really important thing. The accurate history, it needs to be told. There was something that was called the Dawes Act, where when the reservations were established, there was a lot more land that most indigenous nations had. And then there was a way of looking at the number of people in each tribe and saying, okay, there shouldn't be any more than 80 acres for an individual if this land has water. If this land doesn't have water, then it should be, then they can have 100 acres each. And so if there's excess land after that, then the government took it back. And then so there's this whole relationship in the communities where the reservations are now, and the small towns and the cities that have grown up around that. And I felt really happy to hear that truth come out. And like, wow, a principal of a school was willing to say, here, I didn't learn this. I learned that the land was here for the taking. This is what we were taught. It was an open place. There was nobody here. And so I feel like there's a lot of hope in that, that we have to encourage that openness, and whatever the fears are about listening and maybe people losing what they think they have, and that somehow they're going to have to give it to other people of other cultures. But it's like, no, this is our wealth as human beings. This is our wealth. Our wealth is our diversity. If we don't have our diversity, we are not wealthy. It's like looking at the monocrops, the monoculture of the forests, of the plants, of all these things. Our inheritance is, our diversity is our wealth, and our stories are our wealth, and the memory of those stories, they're important. And so I really hope that, I am grateful to the panelists. Thank you for your work and your expertise of what you're doing and how it's making a difference. And, all the other writers that are out there doing this good work to bring the stories forth. I feel like we are in a time of change. We are in a time of the truth coming forward. And may we all be courageous enough to hear one another and listen and appreciate it, because there's so much beauty and so much power about the human story. it's I really hope that maybe this can be of benefit, and much more good work like this can continue on. So thank you guys very much for hosting us today. And it's good to see you, Debbie and Kim and Elizabeth, Danielle, Keith. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
And I want to do one plug that's really related to what you just shared. It's not children's literature, but those of you that are in Eugene and at the University of Oregon watching this year's Common Reading book, which is the book that we have for all of our first year students, is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And there's lots of ways it's embedded in our first year experience curricular programs, but she'll be coming in January, and there'll be a series of activities. So just want to, if you were resonating with it, with what Shinema was saying, I think it behooves us to engage with that particular text and learn from it.
And that is being turned into a young adult version as well.
Good.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm so excited and thrilled that this happened, and I really appreciate all the deep insight that you guys have brought forth during this discussion. It's very meaningful. So thank you. For those of you watching, this has been recorded, so please feel free to share it with anybody who you think might be interested. And just peace for everyone, and thank you again.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.